Okay, 8:30. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the April 2024 READ cohort. Hope you brought your breathing mask because we're going to go high elevation. Whitebark pine. Blake just shared a template for IAP insert. I just put a link to it. It's in the Google Drive, but I put a link to it in the chat. Your viewing pleasure during this. A couple of announcements. The first one is there was an in-person READ class in California that is targeted towards tribal members, getting tribal members, resource advisor qualifications. But they're just right now looking for people so that they don't have to cancel it. So you can always contact them if you're not a tribal member and see if you need it and want an in-person. So look at the email, look at the cohort email about that. And then I think on that tribal side too, that did bring up a lot of tribes are starting to ask for it. There is some people that have some grant money to put those on. So I can get you information or get you in contact with those people who are doing tribal specific resource advisor READ classes. And then the other thing I want to say, so the READ cohort, as you guys know, this is all grassroots. We all sort of steal time from our agencies to do it. And we do a lot of it on our own time. And so, but that's also why we have sort of a big manager group, but we're always looking for more people to help. One thing that we could definitely use help in, if the cohort wants to keep it going, and for the last like 5 years, we've done a sort of a clearinghouse, a way to get the word out about resource advisor assignments. If a lead READ is looking for resource advisors or archaeologists, we can put it out, that information out. The person who's been doing it for a number of years has decided they want to retire, real-time retire, not just from the cohort. So we're looking for somebody that can help with that. It doesn't take a lot of time, but you do have to be available during the fire season to take those calls, take those emails, and then put it up. And we can teach you all that, how to do it. But if there's anything else that you would like to see the cohort do and help with, come be a manager and we'll get that ball rolling. Really, it's an open vessel for people to put information in and get information out. And we want to hear it, and then we could give advice on how we think it might work with our experience as the cohort managers. But we're open to all ideas. So contact me or any other of the cohort managers, and our contact information is in the email. So with that, I'm just going to hand it over to Blake, and you can do your own introduction and on your panel's introduction, because you do a much better job than I will. And we're going to talk about whitebark pine and fire. Thanks, Blake.
Thanks, Lynn. Can you hear me okay? Sound good?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thanks, everybody, for having us and being here. Let me just share my screen. Does that look okay? Get that back up. Okay. Great. So I'm Blake Engelhardt. I'm a botanist with the regional office in Region 5 in California. And presenting with me today are Lacey Hankin, who you saw on the screen earlier. She's also an ecologist with the regional office here in California, and previously a fire ecologist at Yosemite, and has done a lot of work with whitebark pine. And Emma Williams, who's a forest botanist on the Lake Tahoe Basin, is going to be sharing a case study about a fire in the Sierra Lake Tahoe area and effects on whitebark pine. So she'll be helping us present a little later. And then I just want to thank Tova Spector. She's the regional botanist in Region 4. She put together the first draft of this presentation, which she presented last year in Region 4, and we definitely built on that. So thanks, Tova. I think she'll be joining a little bit late and can help answer questions or discussion if there's anything at the end. So with that, we'll jump into the presentation, and this was just a thought I had a few months ago and reached out to Lynn that this might be a timely topic with the recent listing of whitebark pine a little over a year ago, and potentially, you know, fires getting higher in elevation, bigger fires that, and because the species is so widespread, that this might be an issue that resource advisors and fire management teams are going to be encountering and trying to figure out what to do when there's whitebark pine in the planning box or the path of the fire. So we're going to cover just, I'm speaking to a more general audience and a more like national audience. So we're going to cover some real basics about whitebark pine identification, the Endangered Species Act listing status, and then fire ecology and kind of some recommended approaches and avoidance measures during fire, and a couple of case study from the Caldor fire, and just some other thoughts and considerations for whitebark pine during wildfire incidents. And we should have some time at the end for questions and discussion, and totally welcome questions and everyone's input and experiences, if or thoughts. So with that, I'll jump in. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so just some basic identification for whitebark pine. So it's a conifer tree. And a key thing is that it's 5 needles per fascicle or bundle. This is one way to help you identify whitebark pine. Like here's lodgepole where it's 2 needles per bundle. So a key is that identification trait is the 5 needles per fascicle. It often grows in multi-stem clusters. It can be a single stem tree. It can be very short and shrubby crumholts, and I'll show some photos of that in a second. It has fairly smooth light gray bark. And then another key identifier is these dark purple sappy cones. Whitebark pine is a stone pine, so the cones don't open on their own on the tree. Clark's nutcrackers or squirrels actually break the cones open on the tree. So if you see like an open classic pine cone hanging off a tree, it's not whitebark pine. And then it has these dark red pollen cones. And whitebark pine are slow growing, they're at high alpine, subalpine. They can live hundreds to 1,000 years. So it's a long life cycle. Okay, and so here are just some examples of what whitebark pine might look like. Here's from this multi-stem cluster to more of a single stem, almost looking a little bit like a lodgepole from a distance. Here's those Krumholtz mats you might see at higher elevation. And then don't forget about seedlings and saplings. And the fourth life stage that all of us that have been dealing with whitebark pine and ESA consultation is seed caches, which can be scattered throughout the landscape. And this is kind of, the most scenic, picturesque, kind of gnarled ancient whitebark pine. So lots of different looks to the tree. Oops, I keep trying to change the PowerPoint. Okay, and then here's, there are some other 5-needle pines that can be confusing to differentiate whitebark pine from these other species. Depending on where you are in the range of the species, it can co-occur with western white pine. And when they're small, it's really the toughest to distinguish them. Limber pine also can be very difficult or tricky to distinguish from whitebark pine. One key with limber pine, you can see these yellow pollen cones, little different than those bright red pollen cones of whitebark pine. But the key thing here is that, you can see this cone is dried out and open and the seeds have fallen out on the tree. Same thing with the western white pine. You find this intact, open cone on the ground. And with whitebark pine, you wouldn't find it like that. It would be shredded apart by the birds or kind of eaten away in portions of the cone. Even though it can be hard to know for sure if you're looking at a whitebark pine or another 5-needle pine, in some ways it's not always critical to differentiate them because all 5-needle pines are typically like desirable leaf species. So when in doubt, you can err on the side of caution and just, if it's a 5-needle pine, you can try and avoid it if possible. If you're looking to cut line or set up a, develop a landing spot or something, any 5-needle pine, if you can, is typically a species you want to avoid impacting if possible. And so others are like sugar pine, foxtail pine, bristlecone pine, limber, western white, and southwestern white pine. And here's just a little bit more to show all the cones together. And we tried to make this PowerPoint very inclusive and information rich. So, if you want to download it afterwards and use this as a guide, or if you have an incident where you're trying to differentiate between these two, hopefully this can be a good resource down the road. But this shows, it's the limber and whitebark together with the comparison between these closed cones on the tree, that dark purple, almost like wet and moist still, versus the dried out and open limber pine or western white pine cones. Okay, and then here's really the reason why we thought this would be useful to present to this group. Whitebark pine, unlike a lot of endangered or threatened plant species, has a very broad range in the Western US. So, anywhere in the Western US mountains and even into Canada, if people are on assignments up there, you're potentially going to encounter whitebark pine. 80.6 million acres in the Western US, with 70% of the range in the United States. It's across multiple Forest Service regions and national parks. 88% of the US distribution on public lands with the vast majority of that on Forest Service land. And multiple Forest Service regions, basically all the western regions, have whitebark pine. And I just want to emphasize there's a lot of variation in whitebark pine ecosystems and elevational distribution. You know, in the Sierra Nevada, here at the southern extent of the range, people are always asking me, well, what's the elevation cutoff? Like, how low will we find it? And it's a little hard to, you know, to say for certain, but 7,500, 8,000 feet and below that, like, it's pretty uncommon or just sporadic. But as you move farther north, of course, that lower elevation cutoff decreases, as does the upper elevation cutoff. So just be aware that if you're going on assignments in different parts of the range, like where you might encounter the species is going to change, and what that forest looks like and the other co-occurring conifer species is going to transition. And then I also just want to point out, and I'll show this on the next map, that a big portion, but not all, of the whitebark pine distribution in the US is in designated wilderness. Definitely down here in the Sierra Nevada, it's something like 80% of the whitebark pine is in wilderness. But when you get up to the Rockies, that changes, and it's a smaller proportion. And this map on the right shows the distribution, the approximate distribution of whitebark pine, and then this darker green is designated wilderness. So if you're in high elevation wilderness, there's a chance, you know, good chance there might be whitebark pine there. But just because if you're outside of wilderness, you could still be encountering whitebark pine. And then here on the left, this just shows the different land ownerships where whitebark pine occurs. So you can see it's mostly Forest Service and Park Service, with a little bit of BLM and BIA and other tribal lands. Okay, and here's a classic kind of high elevation whitebark pine stand in the Sierra Nevada, where it's, you know, predominantly almost a pure stand of whitebark pine, right at tree line, subalpine, and then that more almost Krumholtz stands right at tree line. But whitebark pine can also occur in mixed stands with other conifers, and you know, be a tall single stem tree looking very much like a lodgepole from a distance. In the Rockies, Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir are some of the common associates. Sierra Nevada, more typical lodge pine, western white, and some of the other species. We care about whitebark pine because it's a keystone species in the subalpine. Those seeds are big fat pine nuts that are super nutritious and important food source for many wildlife species, birds, small mammals, and grizzly bears in the Rockies. And then the trees also influence the snowpack and snow melt, stabilizing soils in these upper elevation, weakly developed and rocky soils, and regulating runoff and snow melt. So whitebark pine was listed under the U.S. Endangered Species Act in December of 2022. And it was listed as a threatened species. So it's definitely, you know, if it occurs within the footprint of a wildfire, it's definitely, you know, an Endangered Species Act listed species that you want to consider. There's no critical habitat designated for whitebark pine. And the 4 primary threats to whitebark pine are white pine blister rust, which is shown in this picture on the bottom. It's a non-native fungus, and it infects the branches and stems of trees and causes cankers. This chewing is from rodents chewing at that canker, and eventually it will kill branches and stems and kill the entire tree. Second threat is mountain pine beetle, and this is classic mountain pine beetle mortality in the upper photo, where the larger stem trees are attacked by the beetles and just the whole tree winks out. So pine beetle stands, you get this like pretty high levels of mortality mixed in. And that can cause like very high fuel loading and put a stand like this at risk should a fire come through. And then altered fire regime, and Lacey's going to talk a little bit about that. But fires, both good and bad for whitebark pine. So just the alteration of fire regimes, as well as the threat of high intensity wildfires, are a threat to whitebark pine. And then, of course, climate change interacts with all of these stressors. And I just wanted to point out, it's the species is also endangered in Canada and has been listed there since 2012. And in terms of recovery of whitebark pine, these are some of the key actions that the land management agencies and nonprofit organizations are putting a lot of effort and have been even prior to the listing towards protecting and restoring whitebark pine. So of course, like the healthy stands we have, we want to try and protect those and maintain those on the landscape. With the white pine blister rust, that fungal disease pathogen being the biggest threat, a key method for conserving and restoring this species is identifying genetically resistant individuals that can be, screened for rust resistance. That's what this picture on the bottom right is showing, trying to identify families of trees that are rust resistant, and then propagating from those individuals and planting rust-resistant individuals back out onto the landscape. And this is important to be aware of during an incident, because there might be particularly high-value trees out on the landscape that have been identified as rust-resistant that are a source of cones for these restoration efforts, and protecting those individuals from burning up in a fire would be a particularly like high priority action to take if you were going to, if there were some known on that forest or in that park and they were marked and you had the locations, like protecting those individuals would be high bang for your buck. Because there's all this effort that goes into cone collection, multiple years of growing out and screening, and then replanting. So though protecting those investments and high value trees could be at least, maybe the highest priority action to take during a fire, or one of. Okay, so Lacey's going to come on and talk a little bit about fire ecology.
Blake, can you hear me okay?
You're a little quiet.
Let me try that. Does that work?
Yes.
Okay.
Great.
Great. That was awesome, Blake. And yeah, so Blake kind of set us up to talk about managing fire in whitebark ecosystems. And it can be a little tricky because it does have that both positive and negative effects in different circumstances. So whitebark pine ecosystems do typically have a mixed severity fire regime. So very heterogeneous spatial patterning, a few small patches of high severity with areas of unburned, as well as some kind of low intensity, moderate intensity fire effects. The fire return intervals do range broadly from about 30 years to over 400 years. So that's a huge range. At least in the Sierra Nevada, most of the whitebark forests are kind of not significantly departed from these intervals. But that definitely varies based on the region, the productivity of the area, as well as kind of the stand dynamics in that system. And whitebark pine ecosystems as a whole are fire dependent. Fire has been a part of these ecosystems for a long time, but individual whitebark pine trees are not fire resistant. So that's kind of an interesting trade-off to keep in mind when you're thinking about fire on the landscape in whitebark systems. Next slide, Blake. Thank you. So with those ecosystem effects, fire can do kind of beneficial work in killing competing shade-tolerant conifer species. It can reduce surface and canopy fuels, and those kind of high-severity open patches are suitable caching sites for Clark's nutcracker. And it can also just generally break up fuel continuity and create greater fire and climate resilience. But at the individual tree level, whitebark pine is a very thin-barked species, so it's easily killed by fire, even low-intensity fire. So just about 10% crown scorch can lead to about 50% chance of mortality. And kind of any cambium or bole char can also lead to a high chance of mortality. So for seedlings and saplings, just 10% of bole char can lead to later mortality. And for larger trees, it's about 50% of bole char. And we can expect to see delayed tree mortality from those effects over the next year or two. So that is something to keep in mind as well. Next slide. So during an incident, we'll go through some things to keep in mind. Blake and I have been working with fire and aviation management to try to get appropriate layers into WFDS and to various READ programs. We will have whitebark pine distribution layers in WFDS, but these will change over time as better distribution layers come out, or you might have a unit level distribution layer that might be more accurate. And then as cone collection areas or planting trials become more widespread, that would also be something to include in WFDS as well. At the unit level, you might also consider if you have information on rust-resistant trees, maybe old growth whitebark, cone collection areas, or planting and kind of research sites. So those could be areas of interest to protect as well. Next slide. Great. So, fire is a natural part of the system, and we don't want to completely exclude fire from whitebark habitat. So kind of what we're looking for in terms of desirable outcomes in regards to fire management are those heterogeneous landscapes that have high fire and climate resilience with a diversity of stand ages and stand structures. And this could look very different based on what region you're in. So in the Sierra Nevada, we have pretty unproductive, sparse stands generally. But in the Rockies, you might have much denser stands with more competitive processes going on. So it could look a little different depending on where you are. Those small fire-caused patches can be beneficial for regeneration and seed caching dynamics. But the unburned refugia are also really important. So they're important seed sources for those nutcrackers going into the future. And especially in areas that have experienced prior mortality from beetles or white pine blister rust, then those seed sources are even more important to protect. In some areas, reducing those competing shade-tolerant conifers is also a desirable outcome, and protecting the high-value individuals. So that might be your rust-resistant individuals or highly productive, a lot of cone production, or your early cereal stands. So limiting reburns before reproductive maturity would also be a priority. And I already mentioned the areas where we might already have a lot of mortality, but in those areas, the standing and downed dead fuel loading could be really high. So trying to reduce those fuel loads while protecting any remaining live trees would also be a goal for fire management. Next slide. Thank you. So again, or in addition, during an incident, so some things to keep in mind. We do want to avoid cutting whitebark pine, especially those reproductive, healthy cone-bearing trees, as much as possible. Of course, some might happen. One thing to keep in mind with this is that whitebark pine is a masting species, meaning it's not cone-bearing every single year. So kind of you might not always see cones, but those kind of large, healthy-looking canopies are probably indicative of pretty reproductive individuals. So in the case where you do want to protect those single or few trees, you can consider removing fuels and litter and duff from around the tree, potentially lining the tree or soaking the base. As I mentioned before, we do want to limit crown scorch and bole char to pretty low percentages in order for that tree to survive. And for that point protection, you might be protecting those rust-resistant or cone-bearing trees. We do recommend using mechanical equipment sparingly. A lot of these areas, that's not really a feasible option anyways, but it could happen, and I think we'll see that in an example from Emma later. You can recommend using retardant drops if necessary to slow the fire, prevent kind of large, high-intensity fire areas. And this is important because whitebark pine is explicitly not in retardant avoidance zones. So it has been shown that it can be beneficial in terms of managing fire and slowing fire around whitebark pine areas. We do want to limit firing operations within whitebark pine stands as feasible. Of course, there's reasons that might need to occur. If there is firing, we want to make sure that it's very discontinuous and kind of allows the fire to creep around those systems and not, have too much intensity throughout the stand. And if there is firing within a whitebark stand, we recommend not directly igniting those whitebark pine trees, since we do want to reduce bole char as much as possible. Fire shelter wrap is not very effective because of that thin bark. So that's not necessarily the best method for single tree protection. And we did share IAP insert with some read messaging for whitebark pine that will hopefully be useful. All right, next slide. Oh yeah, and back to Blake.
Thanks, Lacey. Okay, yeah, Lacey just mentioned this, but I just wanted to point out really intentionally that for the National Aerial Fire Retardant, EIS, and National Forest Service program, whitebark pine did go through consultation for aerial fire retardant application. It was determined to not likely to adversely affect. There are no aerial fire retardants avoidance areas included for whitebark pine, at least in the national maps. And the biological opinion from Fish and Wildlife Service even states here, allowing high intensity fire to burn through stands of whitebark pine would be more detrimental than, the potential effects from applying fire retardant. So don't hesitate to use retardant or to recommend using retardant if you had high value whitebark pine stands that you were trying to protect, if it was, possible and available. Okay, and then did Emma make it on? I'm not sure if she did, because I think our next couples, oh, there she is.
Hey,
Great.
Blake. Yeah, I'm
Hey,
here.
Emma. Awesome.
Hey.
Okay, take it away.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Blake and Lacey. Great chat. So I'm going to share a little bit about the interaction between the 2021 Caldor fire and whitebark pine stands here in the Central Sierras, both on the El Dorado National Forest and the Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit. I know many of you were probably very active in 2021. It was an exceptional fire year here in California, and the Caldor fire started in mid-August, and most of its spread over its 220,000, 100,000 acres occurred in like 3 weeks during pretty extreme fire weather conditions. So it started out, if you take a look at that lower left map, it started out in the Sierra Nevada foothills around 3,600 feet in elevation and traveled about 40 miles to the northeast, crossed the Sierra Crest after about 3 weeks, which is pretty exceptional. It occurred that year during the Dixie Fire as well, but is not a very common event. So the whitebark pine in this area grows mostly, becomes most common above 8,000 feet, and depending on what latitude you're working at, you'll find it at different elevations. But here it starts forming co-dominant stands, mostly with mountain hemlock around 9,000 feet. So most of the effects to whitebark pine we found were in the 9,000 to like 9,800 foot range. Looking at this map on the right, kind of zoomed in, you can see where fire burned into whitebark pine stands. So on the west, you can see a little bit burned in the Desolation Wilderness area, kind of a small patch. Thanks, Blake, appreciate that. And then to the east, up a larger patch on Trimmer Peak, where the fire kind of burned out in some rocky granite outcroppings. You can also see here in the red are dozer line construction. And so whitebark pine most often grows in this area on ridge tops. And so unfortunately there were some substantial impacts from dozer line construction on ridge tops when contingency lines were being constructed. So altogether, there was approximately 500 acres burned and approximately 2 miles of stands that were dozed. In the top left map, you can see the composite burn index, which is a fire severity metric that kind of accounts for fire effects to fuel, soils, and vegetation. And this zooms into that Trimmer Peak area, and Really, it was a run through pretty productive and untreated Jeffrey pine, and mixed conifer forest, and then ran up to the ridgetop to Trimmer Peak, and where really the fire effects are pretty reflective of the scabbiness of the vegetation community, very limited surface fuels, limited canopy connectivity. So we did see some patches of higher severity fire in whitebark pine. All right, next slide. So a little bit more about that. Mary Marr took this picture of the dozer line constructed on Little Round Top. This at the summit there is about 900 or 9,500 feet, excuse me. And that's a mostly whitebark pine dominated stand with some mountain hemlock mixed in and a little bit of western white pine. It's about 80 feet wide and was about 1.5 miles long. It also goes through alpine pincushion communities, which are full of rare plants that we care about a lot. This was, I'll just mention a little bit of the context. This was during a very active period of the fire where it was growing and burning into the Lake Tahoe Basin, where there's a lot of communities and wildland-urban interface. It was a type 1 team, and we had relatively limited direct communication with operations at that point. Mary Marr and Keith Hembrecht were monitoring this area. Mary's really familiar with this area, which was very beneficial, and they mapped this line and prescribed some suppression repair activities. It's extremely challenging operationally to return to this site. It required aerial operations by transporting hand crews and excavator operators in by helicopter, as well as our resource advisor who was overseeing it, Catherine Derchels. A lot of medical support. It was just a very technically difficult operation. So we were fortunate to be able to have a team that could pull it off. The suppression repair involved pulling the down trees that had been pushed into live healthy trees back off of those trees to limit longer term impacts and just mechanical damage to the trees over time, as well as fuel buildup around those individuals. And then pulling the berms back over the line to try to retain some of that seed bank where possible. That's a pretty steep grade up to the summit there. And so in order to try to limit erosion, we did and improve kind of some of the microsite conditions for regeneration of whitebark pine. We did chunk that steep slope a little bit, and then we tried to go with a really light touch in the alpine pincushion communities with mostly handwork. We were able to get some disaster relief funds through the state for dozer line rehabilitation. Through our emergency consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service, they recommended monitoring the site for natural regeneration, and then potentially planting or reforesting, dependent on what we're seeing. We did see in the first year in 2022 some first year seedlings. Survival rates are pretty low with whitebark pine, so we're going to keep monitoring. We are using some of those funds to collect seed from our alpine pincushion plants. We are also there's a lot of enthusiasm around planting sugar pine and western white pine in the basin, especially in areas that were impacted by the fire through dozer lines. But for the time being, we're trying to avoid planting any western white or potentially competing species to provide for that natural regeneration and health of whitebark pine. Then getting into the fire effects, on Trimmer Peak, you can see an example here. Most of the fire effects were to more of the mature whitebark pine individuals. You can see they grow in these clusters of stems up here, and we found that there wasn't any surface fuels to carry fire. So what we think happened is that the litter and duff buildup around the base of these trees ignited from kind of ember rain during the fire. And like Lacey was saying, these trees are not resistant at all to kind of any type of fire effects, especially direct. So we've found approximately like maybe 2,000 to 3,000 mature stems had experienced fire and resulted in mortality to those stems. Most of the seedlings that were growing in the area were fine. I think that's a lot because there wasn't any of that litter and duff buildup. We are using burned area rehabilitation or BAR program funds to do a planting trial to compare the success of direct seeding versus seedling planting in this burned stand. We're hoping this information will help us with some of our other whitebark pine recovery actions and more broadly. We're also able to tap into some Lake Tahoe Restoration Act, which are congressionally allocated funds for some watershed health activities in the Lake Tahoe Basin. And so we'll be using those funds for the longer term seedling planting and monitoring of this site. And that's it for me. Next slide.
Awesome, Emma. Thanks so much. I thought this was a great case study and real active restoration, and so awesome what you guys are doing. And we thought this would be a good case study to share with you all of, what some of the suppression impacts could be and what suppression repair might involve, as well as what kind of fire effects you might see or want to document as a resource advisor during the incident, and that could support some of the recovery post-fire actions. And I'll just to wrap it up really quickly, this is a great transition into some of those follow-up steps that resource advisors might, the information you're collecting might feed into emergency consultation, which effects to whitebark pine from suppression activities would definitely be a part of any kind of multi-species emergency consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service. One thing that's interesting to note for whitebark pine, because it's deliberately excluded from fire retardant avoidance, that's fire retardant application isn't something you'd necessarily need to discuss with Fish and Wildlife Service during emergency consultation, because we've already said that can be beneficial to this and planned for that for the species. And then I just wanted to mention, for burned area emergency response, and so many times the information collected by resource advisors just feeds into the bear assessment that critical or suitably occupied habitat for federally listed species, which whitebark pine would clearly fit, would be definitely a critical value to consider during a bear assessment following wildfire. So I just wanted to mention those two aspects of it too. And that's our presentation. These are some links here to a couple kind of key publications about whitebark pine and fire effects. These are links, hyperlinks here. This is a 3-pager that's really a great, easy reading synopsis. This second paper is a longer peer-reviewed journal article. And then we've got 2 video recordings if you're interested and want to learn more. This first one is an hour-long presentation that 2 of the most prominent whitebark pine researchers just gave a talk last month about fire ecology and management of whitebark pine. I definitely borrowed some of their photos from their slides for this presentation. So you can watch that. And then also this last video is just a shorter 10-minute film about whitebark pine conservation and restoration in general, and about all the efforts the Forest Service is doing. Some of you may be in this video. If you haven't seen it, it's a really excellent video. And that's all we have. Hope that was helpful. And if people have questions or comments or want to share anything that they've seen, that would be great. We've got about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Hey, Blake, this is Pete Irvin, one of the cohort managers. Lynn had to drop off, so I'll just jump in and thank you and Lacey and Emma for a fantastic presentation. Also, Tova for her background work earlier on.
Absolutely.
And just remind folks that the PowerPoint, I think you've already shared it, Blake, with Lynn,
yes.
And it'll get up in the Read Cohort Google Drive, and then we will post this recording of the overall presentation on the Read Cohort YouTube channel in a few days after we have a chance to do some cleanup. Folks, if you have questions, feel free to come off mute and ask them, or raise your hand. Either way.
I have a quick question. I'll put my camera on so you can see me, maybe. Oh, never mind. It's not working right now. Anyway,
No problem.
It's okay. Sorry. So I was working at Siki, and now I am working for Fish and Wildlife, and I just got trained in Read last summer. So still a trainee, and I'm trying to figure out how do we get onto like maybe a suppression effort on one of these fires if we are not with like Forest Service, or like if we're not one of the land managers, if we're with Fish and Wildlife. How do we get into a read trainee spot on a fire? Because there are a few of us up here. I'm up in Portland now, in Region 1, that would like to get on, and also I would love to be on one of these high elevation whitebark fire suppression kind of efforts post fire. I don't have a arduous duty red card, so it would have to be like a lighter duty sort of situation. But anyway, I just thought, is there a resource that I'm forgetting from training where we can sign up to be kind of more actively involved or try to get on one of the lists?
You want to
Great
take that?
question. Amy, go ahead if you've got something, Blake.
No, I was going to say, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. A couple thoughts from the cohort perspective would be starting last year, we did host a spreadsheet or a information source for trainees that were looking for and available for assignments. And actually, Cedar Drake took the lead in monitoring that for us. So there's information about how to sign up for that if you are a trainee, Read, Reef, or ARC, and are listed available through the dispatch process to try to get on an assignment. We also host, and this is the part that Lynn mentioned at the start of the call, a list where folks who are on assignment and are looking for Read, Reefs, or ARCs with particular expertise to kind of post some information, and we can try to be matchmakers there. Couple of things that we're trying to do as the Read cohort. There's information about both of those, I think, in the MailChimp email blast. If not, reach out to any of the managers. And, beyond that, the more you can do to make yourself available, be available, and tie in with folks that you know personally or can network with to try to improve your chances of being remembered when they have a need.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate it. I do remember them talking about that spreadsheet, and it's just now I'm like, I don't remember where that is, but I'll look for the link in the email. And I wasn't sure if we had access to it with Fish and Wildlife, since we're not one of the main managers that's typically on there. So we're a little bit outside the scope, I think. But I will look on there, and thank you. Appreciate that.
Yep, understand. And just to plug that the cohort is interagency and extra agency. So folks from any number of organizations have access to all the resources of the cohort on the Google Drive. And maybe it's Bonnie that's got her hand up. Sorry, I'm not particularly adept. Go ahead.
Oh, that's perfect. Thanks, Pete. Yeah, and thanks to Blake and Lacey and Emma for this great talk. I really appreciate learning about the resources to save, and some good stuff that came out of this for us Reeds. One question I had for Emma was related to the the dozer line, and whether there might have it sounded like you did the best you guys did the best you could in that situation, but if you had any lessons learned that for future that you might have wanted to apply, especially in that dozer line.
Yeah, well, I can start with the fact I was serving as there's a lot of lessons learned. I was serving as the lead resource advisor for the Lake Tahoe Basin, and I'd been on the unit all of like 7 days when the fire burned into. So I didn't have a good local knowledge of the resources. Fortunately, we had a wonderful team of Reeds who did have that local knowledge, but I think it was also my first lead read assignment. So like one of the big lessons learned for me after a little bit more experience was probably working more closely with my agency administrator to try to get more direct communication with our with the Type 1 team's operations section, and try to have a better foresight on some of the issues that could have happened, and make those recommendations like Lacey and Blake were talking about with, could we use retardant or other less impactful methods for this area, and like, what are the objectives of this line? And then in terms, one of the challenges we had was really just getting the resources back up there. I think I mentioned that, and sort of one of the questions we had or uncertainties was what to do with all of that downed woody debris, the dead trees, and not wanting to leave a lot of downslash in case it could invite mountain pine beetle upticks. These were pretty severe drought years, but there weren't really options around that. We couldn't really pile to burn or things like that. So what else? Lessons learned. I was really amazed with the Type 1 team that carried out that repair operation. It was very complex, and they worked very closely with the resource advisors. So I would say they did a phenomenal job making sure there were no injuries and that the work was completed as efficiently as possible. So trusting the team, I think, was one of the things that was like, we did well.
Nice. Great lessons learned. Thanks, Emma. Appreciate that.
Hey, and thanks everyone. I have the unenviable job of minding the clock, so we're getting close to our time limit. Would like to just go around one more time with Blake and Lacey and Emma for any closing comments, maybe starting with you, Blake.
Oh, no, just thanks everyone for your attention and interest in this species. And I hope these the resource, this presentation, as well as there's a 1-pager IAP insert template that's a Word doc, you know, that you could grab and adapt for your incident, add specific locations or something. So that's also available with the presentation. So just thanks so much for everyone's efforts and hard work out there, and be safe.
Great, thanks, Blake. Lacey?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate being here. Feel free to reach out with questions. And I would just say that, you know, a lot of work has been done in the Rockies on fire effects in whitebark, but a lot of other areas of its range, there has not been nearly as much work. So if you are on a fire in those areas, feel free to send pictures or document effects. We'd definitely be interested in hearing and seeing those.
Excellent. Thanks, Lacey. Emma, appreciate that case study. I like specifics.
Yeah, I'll just add that in order to get some of the funding we needed for the recovery work, the photo documentation and mapping was critical. So that's like a huge role of the resource advisors, is to get that intel on the ground, and then that'll help the unit staff follow up appropriately.
All right, thank y'all. Thank you to the about 180 folks was the highest I saw in the participant list during the session. And a reminder of the asks that Lynn made at the start of the call. We're actively looking for somebody to help us lead that, keeping that spreadsheet about incidents that are looking for resource advisors. And we're also always looking for folks with an interest to be one of the cohort managers. With that, be safe. Fire season in my part of the world is going on right now in the southern Appalachians. I know the Southwest is starting to heat up, the plains. Be safe till we meet again next month, May 15th, 8:30 Pacific time. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Emma and Lacey. Thanks, Pete.
Hey, you bet. And awesome presentation. You can tell you
Great.
folks got some blood, sweat, and tears in here, and some, have done this presentation before. This was an awesome hour for our group. So
Great.
thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if people have questions, feel free to pass them our way. And thanks for the work you do hosting this. It's really a super valuable resource. So
Appreciate that, Blake.
Okay.
Like Lynn, I've been enjoying looking at your background the whole time.
Yeah. And then
sweet.
it looks
Thanks
like there was one question. I'm going to try and answer this one question that's in the chat about pruning too. So
Perfect.
Hopefully I think I can do that even after I hang up, right?
Not sure of that.
Okay. Maybe I'll just try and do that real quick.
Okay. Or maybe just put your contact info in so somebody can follow up with you if they're still on.
Yeah.
We're dropping
Yeah.
quick.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you.
Bye.